April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnbergersee with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russin, Stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains,
there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust.
Eliot once wrote to me that he was greatly influenced by Beethoven's late quartets, that he'd play them on the gramophone again and again. And I can remember what he said in his letter. I wish that I could attain in poetry the same kind of suffering as Beethoven expresses in his last quartets.
T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land is the most famous poem written this century and the high point of the modern movement in poetry. On the strength of it, Eliot was to become the most respected poet of his age, a cultural guru who in later life could attract audiences several thousands strong to his lectures. And though Eliot was to have several careers as dramatist, critic, publisher and editor, it was as the author of The Waste Land that he was always primarily known.
I can't think of any poem really as great as The Waste Land. It probably remains the most important poem, certainly of the early part of the 20th century in the English language.
I think his role in 20th century poetry is absolutely towering over everyone else. He's much better than Yeats. Much, much more inventive, much more brilliant, newer. Simply newer. I mean, everything in 20th century poetry is founded on Eliot.
Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1888. He was a frail child, and from an early age he was cosseted and protected from the world. The dominant influence of his childhood was his grandfather, William Greenleaf Eliot, a Unitarian minister, who instilled in the young Eliot a sense of moral propriety and public service. He had a happy childhood, and yet, by the time he went to Harvard University, he felt a deep and unsettling need to break out of the provincial structures of his upbringing.
His family, the Eliots, were the aristocrats of that time in American life. Eliot, as he grew up in this rather large but closely knit family, was aware that the duties which would devolve upon him were those of commitment, public service, public law. These were commitments he never actually eschewed, and throughout his life you see manifestations of them in his various roles he chose to play. Now, in terms of his actual poetry, what you find in the years of St. Louis and the years when he was at Harvard is a poetry which is primarily concerned with gloom, with solitariness, with sexual unease. He's obviously a young man who wants to break out of that very close family situation, which was the condition of his life at that time, but didn't know how to do so. When he was at Harvard, for example, he would go on long, lonely walks through the slums of Cambridge, which was close by. But all the time you feel that he's on a lead and that he's going to be dragged back at any moment, back to the family life, back to the university life, back to all the ambitions his parents had for him. So you get the sense of a very civilized, elegant, aristocratic young man, but one who was trying awkwardly, sometimes unsuccessfully, sometimes to rebel against that background.
Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask what is it. Let us go and make our visit.
The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock was Eliot's first major poem. He wrote it when he was 23, while still a student at Harvard, and it immediately marked him out as a poet of unique originality.
What Eliot gave them was irony and bathos and anticlimax, and also this extraordinary use of imagery in his poetry. If you take the beginning, what you have is the first of the modernist trumps. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. What Eliot is doing here is taking an old cliche, the red sky at night is a shepherd's delight, and turning it through 75, 130 degrees, something like that. I mean, just swiveling it so you don't see it in quite the same way.
You have here a recognizable voice, but quite an unusual one. It had never been heard before, certainly not in English poetry, where his contemporaries in England, and to a certain extent in America, were still lost in a kind of late romantic twilight, where expressions of public disorder were matched only by expressions of private disorder. There's a certain breakdown in the value system, so the language seems thin and etiolated as a result. Here you have a poet and a poem who seems very sure of himself, very sure of what he's trying to do, and very sure he's got his act together, as they say. And this came as a profound shock. When Harold Monroe was shown the poem by Comrade Aiken, he said it was absolutely insane. Now, what he meant by that was it didn't conform either melodically or thematically with anything he was used to reading.
There will be time. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create. And time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you and time for me. And time yet for 100 indecisions and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. In the room, the women come and go talking of Michelangelo. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. For I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a farther room. So how should I presume?
Prufrock is a genuine creation. He is J. Alfred Prufrock. And this is actually slightly different from being Thomas Stearns Eliot. I think Eliot was a rather sophisticated human being. Clearly, a man who was reserved. Virginia Woolf once sent an invitation out saying T.S. Eliot would be here in his four-piece suit. Clearly people saw this, but I think actually a man capable of great passion and not ridiculous, not at times almost the fool.
Well, he was always someone who liked to play roles, even from an early age. People who knew him well, and even people who didn't, noticed that he was, as it were, as V.S. Pritchett said, a company of actors within one suit. His life, in a sense, was a continual parading of roles or masks, and this certainly began when he was at Harvard, where he posed, as it were, as the young dandy. That was one of his great poses. He could also pose as the religious mystic. That was another phase in his life. So the adoption of these dramatic personae in the early poetry would, I think, have come quite naturally to him. In fact, it has been said, and could even be proved, that Eliot is the greatest dramatic poet of our period. You can interpret his early poetry, and certainly you can read it, as a series of dramatic monologues by various characters coming on the stage of Eliot's consciousness. Certainly, that was what immediately struck his contemporaries about that kind of work. And certainly that was the reason why it seemed so different from the kind of work which was being produced by English writers at the same period.
And would it have been worth it, after all? After the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelains, among some talk of you and me, would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead. I have come back to tell you all. I shall tell you all. If one settling a pillow by her head should say, that is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. And would it have been worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile after the sunsets and dooryards and the sprinkled streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor? And this, and so much more. It is impossible to say just what I mean. But as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on a screen, would it have been worthwhile if one, settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning towards the window should say, that is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all.
Prufrock, I think, anticipates The Wasteland in two ways. One is thematic, and the other one is in terms of technique. In terms of theme, it introduces what is actually the theme of a great deal of Eliot's poetry, right up through The Wasteland into The Hollow Men, and it's the theme of the failure to live. If you think about Prufrock, I mean, he's an incredibly inhibited man emotionally, who is, whatever the turmoil inside, very little is coming out. I mean, he's as uptight as a rolled umbrella. In terms of technique, yes, I mean, it is an extraordinary poem in which you have a constant use of bathos, of anticlimax. You have the overwhelming question, which is then refused. Do not ask what it is. Let us go and make our visit. Then you have the biblical pastiche of Ecclesiastes, the meditation on time. There will be time, there will be time. To prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create. But by the end of that, it's time for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea, and the whole thing dribbles away. By the end of the poem, this use of bathos and anticlimax is actually deepened, so it gets a tragic note. I mean, it's not simply ironic.
No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. Am an attendant lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool. Deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times, indeed, almost ridiculous, at times, almost the fool. I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing, each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown.
Prufrock wasn't actually published until 1915, by which time Eliot had left America and settled in England. He came initially to take up a post at Oxford, but quickly discovered in the artistic life of London a more congenial climate for his writing.
For the first time in his life, he found himself with people of his own age who took poetry seriously, took culture seriously, and were able to discuss it at great length on many occasions. So that was one element of it. The other element was that he was an authoritarian by temper, and being an aristocratic American, disdained the American tradition of politics and society. He found in Europe what he'd not been able to find in America, which was a strong, almost medieval cultural tradition, an authoritarian cultural tradition to which he wanted to ascribe himself. It's a decision he never really regretted either, because he never actually went home to live in America again.
Avant-garde life in London during the First World War was dominated by two great energies, Wyndham Lewis and another expatriate American, Ezra Pound. Pound in particular was to play a huge part in launching Eliot's career. Indeed, it was he who organised the first publication of Prufrock. Pound had joined Wyndham Lewis in founding a movement they called Vorticism, dedicated to reforming and modernising English cultural life. Inspired by Cubism and Futurism on the continent, Vorticism was determinedly behind all things modern and experimental. It was spirited and flamboyant, and the Vorticist magazine was, appropriately, called Blast.
Well, as the name Blast indicates, they were really trying to blast away the remnants of Victorianism and English Romanticism, what we'll call the Georgian poets, and they were trying to introduce modernism. What they were trying to do, as a matter of fact, was to create a modern tradition which connected with a past. They were against the sort of idea of tradition as simply carrying on with what your predecessors had done. It was a revolt against your immediate predecessors and a deliberate pushing yourself back into a much more remote past, but a relevant past.
What they're trying to do, people like Pound and Eliot, is really to introduce that kind of revolution into the history of poetry, as it already had occurred in music and painting, and all the antecedents of it existed in France, around about the great dates, 1870, 1880, and so on. What they were trying to do, trying to drag English into the mainstream again, not just the mainstream of modern poetry, but the mainstream of modern art.
The antics of the Vorticists were one of the few colourful aspects of life in wartime London. As the war dragged on, and the enormity of what was happening in the trenches began to sink in at home, the capital took on a blighted mood. And the bleak reality of the modern city found its way memorably into Eliot's verse, when in 1916 he began the poem that was eventually to be published as The Waste Land.
Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. Flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There I saw one I knew.
I saw one I knew, and stopped him crying, "Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Miley, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère."
In relation to a poem like Prufrock, what you have here in Prufrock is a poem which looks backward and also looks forward. I mean, it's modernist, but it's also traditional. It's in the tradition of the dramatic monologue. By the time you get to The Waste Land, you've got something completely different. And if you wanted an analogy, supposing you look towards Picasso, you'd have the Rose period, then the Blue period, Both of them different, but also recognizable. And then suddenly, analytical cubism. Here comes The Wasteland. And, boy, is it all happening. You can't quite follow it, but it seems very, very modern indeed. And there's a lot of modern life in it.
In England, it was what Cyril Connolly called the great knockout up to date. It was a poem which had jazz rhythms, it had urban symbolism, it had anthropological myth, it had the whole gamut of what were then fashionable concerns poured into this slender vessel. And as a result, it was an enormous success.
The Wasteland, as it was published in 1922, is in 5 parts. Furthermore, the whole poem is littered with a plethora of quotes and half-quotes from sources as diverse as nursery rhymes and Dante, all of which led some of its first readers to attack it as being a poem of fragments.
In a sense, it is a poem of fragments. You see, when it was originally about to be published, Eliot was quite happy to have it published in separate issues of the Criterion. And there was one possibility, I think, when it was going to be published in 4 different issues of the Dial. So he wasn't himself convinced about its coherence as a poem. When everyone started saying how wonderful it was, of course, he changed his mind and saw exactly how good the poem was. So on that level, I think it could be seen as in terms, it does have a fragmentary feel about it. On the other level, about the fragments of verse which he introduces into the poem, fragments of the literary tradition, that's very deeply part of Eliot's own psyche. That's his way of finding his own voice by co-opting the voices of other people. You'll find the strange thing about Eliot's poetry is that whenever you read it, you're constantly getting little echoes and murmurs of other people's work. You hear bits of Dante, bits of Baudelaire, bits of Villon, bits of Laforgue, bits of Tennyson, bits of Browning, all just underneath the surface of the poetry. But that, of course, is what gives it its strength. These words are Eliot's words and yet not his words, and it's that strange echoic quality which leads to its being so memorable.
One of the extraordinary things about The Wasteland, of course, is the amount of allusion and the amount of learning and reading that goes into the poem. Eliot uses this, I think, quite straightforwardly in order to show that things have been debased. Perhaps the most significant example is the opening of the game of chess, where Eliot picks up Enid Barbus' speech in Antony and Cleopatra. The barge she sat on like a burnished throne, burned on the water, and then on he goes. In Eliot, this becomes the chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble. And then what you have is, instead of Cleopatra's enormous vitality, you have this incredible sinuous syntax which loses you and picks you up, until finally you realize that the sensuality here is more apparent than real, that this is a woman who is the sum total of her accessories. Her perfumes, her jewels, she has no real vitality. And then, of course, as she brushes her hair and it glows into words, what the words say are, my nerves are bad tonight, stay with me.
The chair she sat in like a burnished throne glowed on the marble, where the glass, held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing. Doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it from satin cases poured in rich profusion. In vials of ivory and colored glass unstoppered lurked her strange synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the sense in odors. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the lequearia, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge sea wood, fed with copper, burned green and orange, framed by the colored stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantle was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug, jug to dirty ears. and other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the stair. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still.
My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you are thinking. Think.
I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones.
What is that noise?
The wind under the door.
What is that noise now? What is the wind doing?
Nothing, again, nothing.
Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing?
I remember those are pearls that were his eyes.
Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head?
But oh, that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent.
What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down so. What shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do?
One of the most innovative aspects of The Waste Land to its contemporary audience was the range of characters it seemed to contain. Eliot was deliberately trying to incorporate into the poem the speech and accents of London life. Indeed, for a long time, he'd considered calling it He Do the Police in different voices.
They were trying to introduce into language of their poetry the words which everyone used in the street, whereas the Georgian poets whom they were rebelling against always wanted to write poems about poetic subjects like the English countryside, sunsets. They were deliberately choosing the dirty canal near the gasworks. They were deliberately choosing these sordid-seeming subjects and, as a matter of fact, creating a strange kind of beauty for them, although, of course, most of their contemporaries didn't recognize that.
Take, for instance, I think one of the most striking things in it must be the dialogue in the pub, the monologue in the pub. You know, you ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique and her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She'd had 5 already and nearly died of young George. Absolutely wonderful stuff. And never there in poetry before. But suddenly, wham, there you are, right in a London pub. And it's marvellous, and clearly they must have loved that.
When Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words, I said to her myself, hurry up, please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back, make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you done with that money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did. I was there. You have 'em all out, Lil, and get a nice set, he said. I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said. And think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. And if you don't give it him, there's others will, I said. Oh, is there, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique. And her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. Well, she's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home, they had a hot gammon. And they asked me in to dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night. Ta-da. Good night. Good night.
Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed, and their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors, departed, have left no addresses. By the waters of Leman I sat down and wept. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long. But at my back in a cold blast I hear the rattle of the bones, and chuckles spread from ear to ear.
When The Waste Land was first published in 1922, it seemed to speak directly to the spirit of its age, but many of its origins were far more personal. In 1915, Eliot had met and quickly married Vivienne Haigh Wood, but it was not to prove a happy marriage. Vivienne was highly strung and given to increasingly bizarre behaviour. Eventually, Eliot was to leave her as she drifted further and further into madness. Meanwhile, the couple were not well off, and as well as his poetry, Eliot was editing a literary magazine, The Criterion, while at the same time doing a full-time job at Lloyd's Bank in the city.
Now, what happened was he suffered something close to a nervous breakdown in the year of the making of The Waste Land. So you have a poem which is immediately and clearly affected by Eliot's tribulations and privations of the period. There's no doubt about that. But on the other hand, you cannot read it as what he called a private grouse or a piece of rhythmical grumbling, I think was his word for it. Because the genius of the man was that he made his own obsessions and his own problems part of the symbols of the age, as it were. He stood in a kind of symbolic relation to his own time and turned his private grief into a public grief on one level. He was able to transmogrify his own personality into something much larger than it really was, so that he could, his private career, as it were, could stand for the decline of the West.
It's a very gloomy poem. It's a poem about the imminence of some kind of apocalypse, as we get very strongly towards the end of the poem, remember? We're all entitled to feel that. I sometimes think we don't feel it as strongly as people did in the aftermath of the First World War, simply because we've made a routine of it. I mean, we have apocalypse for breakfast. But the sense that the world had entered a sort of spiritual desert, which becomes very strong in Eliot later, that all that the Christian can do, he must have been very close to religious conversion, obviously, when he wrote The Waste Land, to some religion or other. Spender says to Buddhism, but whatever it was. He really did think that the world was going through a period where the good man could do nothing but attempt to redeem the time, meanwhile redeeming the time.
It really links up with a poem of W.B. Yeats, in which the lines occur, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Well, that, for Yeats, epitomizes our civilization, but that's exactly what you find also in The Waste Land. This view that people had at that time of everything collapsing, breaking down, the decline of the West, above all the West.
Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter noon, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, unshaven, with a pocket full of current CIF London documents at sight, asked me in demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. At the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi, throbbing, waiting, I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see at the violet hour, the evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from sea. The typist, home at tea time, clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lays out food in tins. Out of the window, perilously spread, her drying combinations, touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled, at night her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays.
According to Eliot, the key figure in The Waste Land is the figure of the blind seer, Tiresias, who appears in the third section of the poem. He has the ability to see the whole of human history simultaneously, and so provides Eliot with another device for comparing the past with the present.
Tiresias symbolizes decadent aspects of the modern world of the wasteland. For instance, sexual ambiguity. He's the old man with withered breasts. That is important. I mean, Eliot is writing about modern decadence, but he's not seeing this kind of decadence as something unique to the modern world. There's a recurrent view of history, I think, in The Wasteland, and decadence is something which is concomitant almost with civilization. You have civilization, decadence. They go side by side. That's partly why the poem is not just a poem about the collapse of Europe in modern times, a particular moment. And I think Tiresias symbolizes all that, or signifies all that.
I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, perceived the scene and foretold the rest. I too awaited the expected guest. He, the young man carbuncular, arrives. A small house agent's clerk with one bold stare, one of the low, on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The meal is ended, she is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses, which still are unreproved, if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response, and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have forsuffered all enacted on this same divan or bed. I who have sat by Thebes below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead. Bestows one final, patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass.
Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over.
When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again alone.
She smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. Now, in Goldsmith, this is a song which is sung by Olivia in The Vicar of Wakefield when she goes back to the place where she's been seduced. It's quite a different thing. When lovely woman stoops to folly, she sings, and learns too late that men betray. What balm can soothe her melancholy? What charm can wash her guilt away? The only art that guilt can cover, to hide her shame from every eye, to grant repentance to her lover and wring his bosom, is to die. In other words, in those days, when you were seduced and you fell, it was something serious. You know, you went off and you killed yourself. It's the only solution. Now what do? You know, they brush their hair, put a record on the gramophone. And everything has been debased by the time it gets there.
The Wasteland that was eventually published is not the poem Eliot originally wrote. He Drew the Police in Different Voices was a much longer series, which Eliot showed to Pound for his opinion, and which Pound edited into the version that we know today. It's small wonder that Eliot dedicated the poem to Pound, whom he called that wondrous, necessary man, with the words Il miglior fabbro, the better craftsman.
The original Wasteland had many other elements. There was an element of pastiche, parody, dramatic virtuosity. It was to be a much larger statement than the poem we have now. What happened was that Eliot gave the poem to Pound, and Pound performed upon it what he called a Caesarean operation. He heard Eliot's music and decided that the music was the most important thing. So he excised the parody, he excised the pastiche, he excised the dramatic virtuosity. And what was left was a much shorter poem, but a poem which was much more clearly marshalled around the evidence of Eliot's music. See, the thing about Eliot was that all his feelings, his firmest feelings, seemed to cluster around cadences, literary cadences, largely cadences which he heard from his childhood. And throughout The Wasteland, and indeed throughout his other work, you hear the same music. It's mournful, incantatory, resonant music, which is Eliot's music, the music of his being. And what Pound did in The Wasteland was to let that music come forth, let that music be heard. And when he did so, the poem, as it were, became a unity around that particular fact. Other people heard the music too. That's why the undergraduates chanted The Wasteland as they chanted Swinburne a generation before. So in a sense, it's what Eliot called the auditory imagination, what I would call the music of Eliot's being, which is the formal unity of The Wasteland.
The Wasteland, some of the bits of it, you go back, right back to 1915, in fact, when he was 27, 7 years before the poem was written, possibly even earlier than that. So this process of gradual agglomeration and then cutting, and then saying, that's the poem. This poem is not like, say, a dramatic monologue of Browning's, which is another, of course, important source. It's not like that because it hasn't got narrative connectedness. It's not meant to appeal to what he called the logic of concepts. It's meant to appeal to the logic of the imagination. What you have to do, he said, is the most difficult thing of all to do, is to, this distinguishes good readers of poetry from bad in Eliot's view, is to see the relationships between what are apparently disparate bits of imagery and fragments of narrative and so on, and hold it all by an act of the imagination into some kind of unity. Very keen on it being a unity, but that unity can only be had by particularly intense kinds of attention, which he didn't incidentally think many people were capable of.
This music crept by me on the waters and along the Strand up Queen Victoria Street. Oh, city, city, I can sometimes hear beside a public bar in Lower Thames Street the pleasant whining of a mandolin and a clatter and a chatter from within, where fishermen lounge at noon, where the walls of Magnus Martyr hold the inexplicable splendor of Ionian white and gold. The river sweats oil and tar, the barges drift with the turning tide, red sails wide to leeward swing on the heavy spar. The barges wash drifting logs down Greenwich Reach past the Isle of Dogs. Way-ya, la-la, lay-ya, wa-la-la, lay-ya, la-la. Elizabeth and Leicester beating oars. The stern was formed, a gilded shell, red and gold. The brisk swell rippled both shores. Southwest wind carried downstream the peal of bells, white towers. Way-ya, la-la, lay-ya, wa-la-la, lay-ya, la-la.
Trams and dusty trees. Highbury bore me, Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond I raised my knees, supine on the floor of a narrow canoe. My feet are at Moorgate, and my heart under my feet. After the event, he wept. He promised a new start. I made no comment. What should I resent? On Margate Sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people, who expect nothing.
When the poem was first published in book form, Eliot added 3 pages of notes, scholarly references and clues to the way the poem should be read. In particular, he acknowledges a debt to 2 anthropological works, From Ritual to Romance and The Golden Bough. In later life, Eliot was to claim that he only added the notes because the poem as it stood was too short to be published as a book. But whatever the truth, the notes have spawned a considerable academic industry.
The notes should be taken with a lot of grains of salt. They are rather illuminating, especially in pointing out Tiresias. But I think Eliot himself once said about the poet is like a burglar who throws the watchdog a large lump of meat, and while the watchdog is eating the meat, he gets away with the burglary. Well, what does that mean? I think it means, in the case of The Waste Land, that Eliot liked to think of all these scholars and teachers and people occupying themselves with explaining what The Waste Land was about and following all these false trails that he'd laid down in the notes.
Eliot, as a poet, emerged at a time when English literature as a university discipline was becoming more and more prominent, with critics in England like A. Richards and in America like Clarence Brooks, who were, as it were, becoming the new gurus in the academic establishment. Now, Eliot, I think, who was nothing if not astute, realized this fact. And it could be said, I think, without overstating the case, that Eliot started to write poetry which would be not only approved of by the academic establishment, but could be studied by that academic establishment. I think he realized that immortality, if such it was to be, or at least fame, was to be garnered from the universities as much as from the newspapers. And I think he started to pitch his poetry in that direction.
And there has been a huge industry. These must be the 17 or 19 most annotated pages in the history of English literature. And it seems to me that in the end, we're actually getting there. It's very important that we do understand the poem properly. And every time one reads it, one discovers something new, something fits better. And I think actually what's happened is the explanations have in fact got simpler. It is clear now, after all this mulging around, after all every cupboard has been turned upside down, every bed has been looked under in English literature, after all of this, it's clear that there are three main strands in the poem that we have to bear in mind. Fertility myths, though these are much less important than we originally thought they were, and Eliot in the 1956 lecture in Minnesota actually said that he was sorry he'd sent people off on a wild goose chase. Fertility myths, Christ and the resurrection, and the Buddhist notion of reincarnation, which is also clearly there in the poem and has been rather ignored to date, but helps to explain the whole ambiguity of the poem. Because in the Buddhist religion, what you want to do is not be reborn. You want to achieve nirvana, a state of enlightenment. But at the same time, you have a tremendous urge to be reborn because you want to go on living. So that throughout the poem, there are these two impulses running side by side.
I think to say that one can explain the poem is a bit like saying that you can explain Cézanne or Picasso. There are things you can say about it that might be helpful, but you can't explain it in the sense of unfold it and make it simpler to apprehend. But in the end, what you've got to do is to stand in front of it, really, and attend to it in the best way that you can manage. I don't think there's any way of having it explained to you.
After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frost is silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder, of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying, with a little patience. Here is no water, but only rock, rock, and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock, one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry, and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit. Here one can neither stand nor lie nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water, and water a spring a pool among the rock. If there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees. Drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water.
Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together, but when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding, wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? What is that sound high in the air? Murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is that city over the mountains, cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air? Falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London. Unreal.
5 years after The Wasteland was published, Eliot was received into the Church of England, and he remained a convinced believer for the rest of his life. He became an eminent publisher with Faber and Guire, now known as Faber and Faber, and an increasingly respected poet and critic. After publication of 4 quartets during World War II, he largely abandoned poetry in favour of verse drama, and plays like Murder in the Cathedral and The Cocktail Party introduced his work to a whole new audience. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1948. Despite the acclaim, however, Eliot remained a lonely and isolated man. It was only on his marriage to his secretary, Valerie Fletcher, in 1957, that he enjoyed, at the end of his life, the happiness he'd not known since childhood. He died in 1965, and after her husband's death, Valerie Eliot declared that he felt he'd paid too high a price to be a poet, that he'd suffered too much.
His achievement is very difficult to summarise. The fact is, he never repeated himself. I mean, this is the main thing. And he was enormously inventive. I mean, he went from one thing to another, whereas other poets repeat themselves. Eliot didn't. And his great achievement, actually, of course, is to make this a myth of how the poet should behave.
Eliot's triumph was not just that he wrote poetry which will probably be remembered as long as the English language is read, but also that he, in his own person, represented and sustained a culture which was on the point of falling apart. He put together what you might call as the last vestige of a European international literary culture. He represented it in his own person, and he gave it shape out of his own obsessions, which is the most remarkable thing. He, as it were, came to represent it because he needed to represent it. He wanted that authority, so he provided it himself. So on that level, it's a most remarkable achievement. On another level, he made his poetry the music of the age, but he only managed that by borrowing, co-opting the voices, the cadences, and the tones of other previous poets. So we have this strange paradox of a man who sustains the culture through his own obsessions and creates the music of our age through borrowing the music of other people's periods.
A woman drew her long black hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on those strings. And bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings and crawled head downward down a blackened wall. And upside down in air were towers tolling reminiscent bells that kept the hours, and voices singing out of empty cisterns and exhausted wells. In this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing over the tumbled graves about the chapel. There is the empty chapel, only the wind's home. It has no windows and the door swings. Dry bones can harm no one. Only a cock stood on the roof tree. Cocorico, cocorico, in a flash of lightning. Then a damp gust bringing rain.
The central despair of The Wasteland is really religious despair. And I suppose the central inspiration is the Old Testament, is the Bible. What are the roots that clutch, and so on. It's the vision all the way through is is Christ at Emmaus and so on. The vision is really a religious vision.
Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant. The jungle crouched, humped in silence. Then spoke the thunder. Da.
Data. What have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries, or in memories draped by the beneficent spider, or under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms.
Diadvam. I have heard the key turn in the door once, and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key. Each confirms a prison only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus.
Damyata. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Poi s'ascosi nel fuoco che li affina quando fiam uti chelidon. Oh, swallow, swallow, le prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. Why, then I'll fit you. Hieronymo's mad again?
Data.
Diadvam.
Damyata.
Shanti.
Shanti.
Shanti.